Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for the warm welcome. I would like to begin my presentation with a quotation. In September 1950, the Regional Office for Reparations in Stuttgart wrote to Josef Jäger, "To our regret, there is no legal possibility to grant compensation for imprisonment in the Buchenwald concentration camp. According to the investigations carried out, you were not listed as a political prisoner in this camp. Certainly, you suffered a grave injustice as a result of your unlawful deprivation of liberty by the National Socialist regime. However, with the current state of reparation legislation, we have no means of compensating for this injustice." The addressee of this letter, Josef Jäger, had been arrested by the Gestapo in April 1938 and deported to Buchenwald concentration camp, where he remained imprisoned until the liberation of the camp in April 1945. The reason why the Stuttgart compensation authorities rejected his application on formal grounds was his inmate category. Jäger had been stigmatized and persecuted as a so-called asocial and work-shy during the National Socialist era. Both are pejorative terms from the sources which can hardly be avoided in my talk, so I ask you to think of these difficult terms in quotation marks. They were used to label diverse groups like long-term unemployed, beggars, homeless people, alcoholics, prostitutes, pimps, and defaulting parents. They were excluded from the National Socialist Volksgemeinschaft and persecuted. The culmination of this persecution measures was a wave of arrests in April 1938 when the Gestapo deported over 1,900 men to the Buchenwald concentration camp because they were considered as work-shy, or in German, Arbeitsscheu. In the wave of the arrests that the criminal police then organized in June 1938, more than 9,400 men were sent to Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen concentration camps. These two nationwide waves of arrests were later referred together as Aktion, Arbeitsscheu, Reich, Action. Even though more and more research on the persecution of socially marginalized people has appeared in the recent years, there are still clear research gaps, especially at the regional level. This concerns not least the level of compensation on which I will focus in my today's talk. I will give an insight into the compensation practice towards people who were stigmatized as asocial or work-shy during the National Socialist era, especially those who became victims of the Arbeitsscheu Reich action. Since my results go back to a research project on the history of the Gestapo in Württemberg and Hohenzollern, I will refer to the first wave of arrests conducted by the Gestapo in April 1938 in this region in the German Southwest. Therefore, I will give a short overview of the Aktion Arbeitsscheu Reich and its victims from Württemberg and Hohenzollern. I will then present the compensation authorities in the region. Finally, I will go into the actors, processes, and decisions of the compensation practice towards those affected by the Arbeitsscheu Reich action from 1945 to the 1970s. First, then, the action itself. The Arbeitsscheu Reich action was the climax of the persecution of socially stigmatized and marginalized people during the National Socialist era. The arrests by the Gestapo took place throughout the Reich on April 21st, 1938, eventually the beginning of May, and eventually between the beginning of May and the beginning of June of the same year, a total of 118 men from Württemberg and Hohenzollern were deported to Buchenwald. Upon their arrival, lists of personal effects like this one were drawn up. Please note the handwritten abbreviation ASR at the top left, which stood for Arbeitsscheu Reich in the Buchenwald camp administration. The victims were all male and mostly came from the working class. It can be assumed, and in several cases it was witnessed, that after their arrival, they were assigned to the group of so-called Asocials with the black triangle on their prisoner clothing visible to all. More than 2/3 of those affected were released from Buchenwald during the National Socialist era. 3 men were liberated by American troops in Buchenwald in 1945, and more than 16% of the men died in National Socialist concentration camps. Most of the survivors returned to their former places of residence. Unlike several other victim groups, the former asocial prisoners did not, despite initial attempts, succeed in building up their own organization after 1945, which could have provided lasting representation of their interests. The persistent social stigmatization, as well as the lack of a group identity, significantly reduced the chances of such a self-organization. I would now like to briefly discuss the institutions of compensation in Württemberg and Hohenzollern and their development. First of all, it should be pointed out that the territory of Württemberg and Hohenzollern was divided in 1945 into 2 different Allied zones, occupation zones in the post-war period, the US occupation zone in the north and the French occupation zone in the south. Accordingly, 2 states were established, Württemberg-Baden with Stuttgart as the state capital in the north, and Württemberg-Hohenzollern in the south with Tübingen as the seat of the state government. It was not until 1952 that the 2 states were united to form the state of Baden-Württemberg. Initially, the Allied occupation authorities gave an impetus to support former concentration camp prisoners. In Württemberg-Hohenzollern, for example, the care and support of victims of the Nazi regime was initiated in June 1945 at the district level on the orders of the French military authorities. Victims of Nazi persecution were to receive increased food rations in an order issued in August 1945. It was added that only political persecuted persons were entitled to such rations. Already in this early phase, socially stigmatized victim groups were systematically excluded from support. Formal exclusion of socially stigmatized Nazi victims continued for decades, embodied by regulations and laws on reparations and compensation. This phenomenon here, but this phenomenon was not limited to the 2 southwestern states under consideration here, but it was in place in the compensation legislation of the Federal Republic too. Initially, reparation was located at the level of the districts. From 1946 onwards, specific state offices for reparations were created in Tübingen and Stuttgart, respectively as higher level authorities. In his research, historian Hans-Dieter Schmidt claimed that the restitution authorities did hardly have any personal files on those affected by the Arbeitsscheu Reich campaign. Based on my research on Württemberg and Hohenzollern, I can clearly contradict this assumption. In almost half of the cases of the former prisoners of the action, 1 or more application for compensation were filed. The corresponding restitution files constitute the main source for my presentation. I discovered 58 such files in the state archives in Ludwigsburg and Sigmaringen. In 98% of these cases, notifications were issued, and in 96 of them were ultimately rejected. Most of the people affected or their relatives were applied for compensation in the 1950s and 60s in accordance with the Federal Compensation Act, Bundesentschädigungsgesetz. They mostly applied for compensation for the deprivation of liberty during the concentration camp imprisonment. In the applications, a large proportion of those affected invoked political opposition to National Socialism, such as critical remarks about the regime or the refusal to join the NSDAP or the SA as the reason for their imprisonment. Some, however, reported that they had not known the reason for their arrests, like this applicant, for example, did. The applications were rejected for different reasons. Some were purely formal aspects, but others were political reasons. One application was rejected because the applicant was not registered in Baden-Württemberg, another because he had lost his civil rights. In 3 cases, the rejection of the application was also based on the applicant's membership in the SA. Apart from such factors, the restriction under paragraph 1 of the Federal Compensation Act proved to be the biggest hurdle for the applications, namely that only those persons could be entitled to compensation who had been persecuted because of their political opposition or for reasons of religious beliefs or race. In the view of the employees of the restitution authorities, the compensation authorities, the most that could come into play as a reason for compensation was the political opposition to National Socialism. In order to decide whether this was the case, various forms of evidence were gathered. This included letters from character witnesses, former fellow prisoners, the Buchenwald Committee, mayors, local police officers, and local branches of the Association of Persecutees of the Nazi regime, the VVN. In these statements, in the context of their restitution of their compensation proceedings, the applicants were often stigmatized again as their arrest was attributed to alleged asocial behavior. For example, the Tübingen Regional Police Headquarters reported in 1947 about one applicant. Through investigations carried out elsewhere, it was established that the aforementioned is a work-shy person and otherwise not good of repute. According to various people of good character and reliability, R is said to have been sent to a labor camp because of permanent neglect of work. In many cases, the local VVN branch informed the compensation authorities that the applicant was persecuted as asocial, but statements often resulted in negative decisions. However, VVN representatives or other agencies confirmed for some applicants that they had been active in or near the Communist Party before their arrest, and formulated the assumption that the political activity must have been the decisive reason for the imprisonment, and the alleged work shyness merely a pretext. On several occasions, the VVN also took on the representation of victims in compensation proceedings. This already shows that when assessing the case of on the basis of the character references and witness statements, it was often not possible to draw a clear line of demarcation between behavior assessed and assessed and asocial and political reasons for persecution. In at least 3 cases, people concerned had been imprisoned in the Württemberg concentration camp Heuberg for several months in spring 1933. The fact that they had imprisoned so early, had been imprisoned so early, made many of these contemporary beliefs that they must have been political prisoners. The contradictory nature of this situation is shown by the case of Eugen Laub, whom you see here. His application for compensation for deprivation of freedom was rejected in 1960. His 1-month imprisonment in 1933 was recognized as due to political opposition, and a small amount of compensation was paid. His much longer imprisonment in the Buchenwald concentration camp in 1938 and 39, on the other hand, was rejected with reference to his prisoner category as asocial. Others had been sentenced for imprisonment for anti-regime statements before 1938. This vagueness of the categories left the employees of the restitution authorities room for maneuver, which, however, they rarely used. Only in 1 case, the final application was positively decided, and it was an application by a Communist Party member who had the support of the local VVN branch and was ultimately recognized as a political opponent of National Socialism. In the first 5 years after the war, the victims tended to have better chances of being recognized as Nazi victims and receiving compensation in the latter years than in the latter years. During this time, as the case files show, local character witnesses or the local regional branch of the VVN played the decisive role in the proceedings. From the 1950s onwards, the International Tracing Service, ITS, in Bad Arolsen received an increasing number of requests for information and compensation proceedings. The ITS was able to access the records of numerous concentration camps. In particular, for Buchenwald, the records are largely complete, especially for the early years of the camp. From the perspective of the employees, the restitution authorities, the incarceration certificates created in Bad Arolsen on the basis on these documents must have had the advantage that, unlike the character references, they used to be could be considered as objective. In addition, on the basis of the perpetrator documents, they could usually assign the applicants to a certain category of prisoner. The mention of the reasons for imprisonment, work-shy or asocial, in the ITS incarceration certificate, as can be seen here, was generally interpreted as by the staff of the compensation authorities as a reason for denying the application. As with earlier regulations, it was not the fact of the concentration camp imprisonment or the injustice suffered that was decisive for the applications for compensation, but rather the motives of the former persecutors and how they categorized their victims. The access of the compensation authorities to the ITS incarceration certificates diminished the importance of the statements of local actors that were still obtained in the application procedure. For the most part, the positive decision was only made. A positive decision was only made if no ITS incarceration certificate was obtained. Only in 2 cases was the application for compensation approved, despite the existence of an ITS certificate. I come to the conclusion. The picture that emerged from the files that I examined is one of a long-lasting stigmatization and exclusion of the former concentration camp inmates with the black triangle. Although this exclusion was clearly stated in the regulations and legal texts, ambiguities and unanswered questions arose in concrete practice, especially when the investigations found signs of both political persecution and imprisonment under the category asocial. Such cases offered the authority staff room for maneuver in their decision. These changed and narrowed over time. In the first post-war years, several applicants gained partial access to communal support services. Since the early 1950s, as the incarceration certificates of the ITS became the standard of official procedure, even more applicants were confronted with systematically exclusion from compensation. In the 3 decades after 1950, possibilities for those affected to obtain recognition and subsequently compensation largely closed. Many victims did not live to see the gradual recognition that began in the 1980s. Thank you for your attention.